Good morning and welcome. We are Arizona State University students here today to talk to you about the sinking islands of the Philippines. Now, imagine you are in fifth grade. You live in a small island off of the coast of Bohol, Philippines. Your family, your friends, everyone you've ever known, the only life you have ever known is contained within this tiny fishing island. One day in 2013, there's an emergency that you are not familiar with. The ground begins to shake and there isn't a good place to take cover. You scramble along with the rest of your community to get out of the way of harm. When it's over, you're grateful that the ground has stopped shaking, but then you realize that there's destruction all around you. You are only 11 years old, so you don't know that the land that you are standing on, the only home you have ever known, has just sunk 1 meter, and it will continue to sink for the foreseeable future. The waters from the sea begin to fill the streets, and eventually your home is also filled with water. 1 year later, the wrath of Typhoon Queenie rolls in and causes even more damage to your island community. This time, the floods took away all the small family farms and started a cycle of flooding with every new and full moon phase. You hear the adults speak of climate change, global polluters, rising sea levels. You don't know exactly what all that means, but what you do know is that walking to school with your shoes above your head is now a reality. And despite all this, you continue to live on a sinking island, looking forward to the day when you can find peace and tranquility once again, and hoping that your government, along with a nonprofit organization, can work together to help mitigate some of these impacts from the climate disasters. So I want to welcome Rebecca and the rest of the team from the World Resource Institute. We thank you for the opportunity to present today. We are all sustainability graduate students at Arizona State University, and we'll briefly introduce ourselves. My name is Tina Catron.
I'm Cassie Hoover.
I'm Clinton Reynolds.
And I'm Jess Tutland.
And you'll hear from each of us today as we share our presentation on the sinking islands of the Philippines and offer some perspective on how climate change is impacting the region and will continue to impact the other 58 island nations around the world. WRI already has programs established in the Philippines, but we want to start with a brief reminder of some of the important details about the country that are relevant to our presentation. I also want to point out that we have identified climate-related disasters in every region of the Philippines over the past 2 decades. The slide you see here shows this and gives a visual representation of the climate impacts that are facing this region. The Philippines are an archipelago consisting of 7,100 islands, 80 million people, and it's highly vulnerable to climate disasters. The Philippines face some of the highest disaster risks in the world, and these are projected to intensify as our climate changes. The inspiration for this presentation came from WRI's vision of finding solutions and scaling them to help adapt to climate change. We believe that the climate work in the Philippines can generate mitigation strategies that can be applied around the world in areas facing similar climate vulnerabilities. This data graph shows the number of climate-related disasters that have caused significant flooding in the Philippines over the last 30 years. And as you can see, the flooding has been consistently unstable. It spiked between 2010 and 2013 and continues to be unpredictable in the Philippines year over year. What is important to note here is that these trends show a slight downturn since the earthquake and subsequent typhoon in 2014. But the trends also show that after a period of fewer disasters, the region can almost always expect a spike of flooding due to climate-related disasters shortly thereafter. So now I want to pass it off to Clinton Reynolds. Go ahead, Clint.
Thanks, Tina. In 2013, 4 low-lying communities in the Philippines were hit with a 7.2 magnitude earthquake. These communities are Bilayang-Bilayangan, Pangapasan, Ubay, and Patasan, and are found relatively close to the larger island of Bohol. The earthquake caused land subsidence across all 4 islands. Prior to the earthquake, the islands were already relatively low-lying and regularly experienced partial flooding with the passage of strong typhoons. Next slide, please. Flooding days often occur for up to a week around the new and full moon phases each month, and the monsoon season brings more frequent flooding and complicates disaster risk management. This creates disruptions to everyday life, including sleeping patterns, especially from September to March, classroom activities, as the floodwaters are very distracting to the children, local business operations, reliable electricity services, and commercial toilets are also flooded and cause water contamination. There are no freshwater wells on the islands. Residents rely on rainwater collection for everyday use. This makes this makes them more dependent on rainfall patterns, which are often unpredictable. Next slide, please. These islands continue to be at high risk of coastal flooding, as shown by the World Resources Institute Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas. Next slide, thank you. And as seen here, drinking water, sanitation, and untreated wastewater are all deemed high risk or extremely high risk by the World Resources Institute. Despite all this, community members are committed to living their lives in their existing communities. None of the community members have moved off the islands, and in fact, populations have continued to rise. While the environmental conditions are significant, these communities have a strong connection to their lands and want to stay. One of the specific reasons they want to stay is that they want to be close to their livelihoods, which are primarily fishing based. The people are strong and value resiliency in the face of challenges. And now I'd like to pass it over to Cassie Hoover.
Let's spend a couple of moments talking about some of the more significant adaptation strategies that these communities are using in order to stay on these islands. So the first area that we're looking at is really about homes and businesses. And the goal here is to elevate or get above the floodwaters, either entire homes or businesses or belongings, if that's not possible. One of the most successful ways that they've been able to do this for the resources that for the communities that have the resources is elevating on stilts. But even in communities where there aren't stilts or access to the resources to use stilts, the communities are harvesting coral stones from the local coral reef or potentially using garbage or waste in order to get their floors up. It's worth noting related to the coral stones that harvesting from the coral reefs could have potentially detrimental effects down the path because healthy coral reef systems help to mitigate some of the significant waves that happen during climate-related weather events. Through the communities, one of the ways that they're adapting is just continuing to live their lives. So Clint mentioned some of the distractions that are caused by hosting school during floodwater events. But they don't have the option now to close schools during flooding because flooding is happening so significantly throughout the year. And so they continue to hold classes and try to focus students despite the distraction. And then finally, they've adapted their routines. So during certain portions of the year, flooding is more likely to happen at night. And so family members are choosing to have at least one family member stay up through the night in order to watch for significant flooding and warn others and make sure that their belongings stay safe. If you go to the next slide, this really captures the sentiment that we've been talking about, that the people of these islands do not want to leave. They really have a strong connection to this place. One of the mitigation strategies that was proposed or attempted was actually migration. So the Philippines government bought some land on the mainland that these folks could migrate to if they wished, and no one has taken them up on this offer. There's really a strong connection to this place and a desire to continue to adapt in place. And if we take a step back on the next slide and think about the globe and what's being experienced for other coastal communities, other communities are under threat of climate change, just as these communities in the Philippines are. So a conservative estimate is that seawater levels will rise by at least 1 meter by 2100. And that's going to put 410 million people within risk of these significant flooding situations, as these Philippines islands already are today. In addition, extreme sea level events have increased. So what used to be once in a lifetime typhoons or hurricanes are now happening much more frequently. And in addition to the sea level rise, this land surface subsidence, which means sinking. So this sinking is reporting for most of the inhabited coastal lowlands globally. So you've got a situation where the lands are sinking, not as dramatically as this earthquake caused for these islands, but slowly over time they're sinking while the seawaters are rising. And that's going to continue to cause challenges for coastal communities beyond just this Philippines community that we're talking about. So if we go to the next slide, the question before us is what can we do about this? And the opportunity that we have is to think about these Philippine community islands that we're talking about that are really at the forefront of what other coastal communities are going to experience in this space, thinking about how we can help them with solutions that can then be scaled as more and more communities face similar situations. So I'll hand it over to Jess to take us through the remainder of the presentation.
Thank you, Cassie. Local communities want the right to determine their own adaptation strategy to these climate change concerns. These communities are on the front lines of climate change impacts, especially vulnerable communities. However, many times these communities do not have a place at the table to discuss, strategize, and facilitate the solutions to the problems that impact them the most. There needs to be a fundamental shift from the current top-down approach to a new model where local communities and governments have the greatest power and access to resources to develop and maintain their resilience to climate change and their way of life. The Philippine people are seeking more long-term solutions to address these health and safety concerns, maintain their homes and communities, but on their own terms. And this is where you come in. Next slide, please. So what we are asking is your help in initiating a self-sustaining, locally led climate adaptation effort in the islands in the Philippines. We want to also create forward-thinking strategies that can be replicated in other coastal areas around the world. And in keeping with the principles for locally led adaptation, we are asking for the following: provide education on climate risks and uncertainties, along with safety and health impacts. In partnership with the local community, help us and the community to develop solutions using a combination of local, generational, and scientific input that will enable lasting resilience and local buy-in. And lastly, administer assistance in the collaboration of different sources of funding across organizations, initiatives, and levels to avoid duplication and enhance efficiencies. Next slide, please. So why are we coming to you specifically? With your partnership with the Adaptive Action Coalition, you are on the forefront of using locally led adaptation to provide community-based solutions to the attention of governments and maintain local knowledge and expertise in climate discussions and finance. In this adaptation proposal, we are looking at the following: improving the lives of the Philippine people that currently reside on these islands. Specifically, we are proposing that 80% of all houses on each island to be built or adapted to be on stilts to improve their way of life and mitigate current health and safety concerns in the short term. Building the capacity of the Philippine people to engage, shape, and build their own solutions to save their own communities in a sustainable way. And one way we can see this specifically is to stop chloral degradation around the islands and engage the Philippine people in developing their own strategies to regenerate this natural resource. And long-term, continue the engagement with the locals to develop long-lasting infrastructure solutions, which will enable them to stay in their communities that they love for generations to come. And lastly, and going beyond just the scope of the Philippine Islands, assisting with establishing a methodology that can be scaled up and applied to similar communities and islands around the world. The sinking islands in the Philippines has been a slow motion disaster that has been getting wider and wider attention as the situation has become worse and worse over time. A locally led effort would bring not only much needed attention and relief to the Philippine people in these areas, but also additional recognition and focus on the locally led adaptive framework that will accelerate resilience and equity for the community and the world as a whole. Successfully led efforts will also bring in more donors that would want to support initiatives like this and that will use their donations wisely and will last and result in lasting change. Next slide, please. So Thank you for your time. What can we do to get this project started today?